All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Laura. So we only have about 20 minutes, so let's just get right to it. It's 2018. Why are we still talking about disinformation? Is it still a threat?
Thanks, Julia. And it's great to see everybody here and to have a chance to talk about these issues. You know, disinformation, propaganda, this is an old threat. This isn't anything that's particularly new. So why is it that we have spent so much time focusing on this issue over the past few years? Well, a NATO communique just in June, focusing on hybrid threats, talked about the fact that the increased speed, scale, and intensity facilitated by rapid technological change and global interconnectivity has made disinformation a new kind of threat. And what we see is that disinformation, it's often coupled with other hybrid tools. In fact, again, NATO has talked about this full spectrum of hybrid threats, including disinformation, cyber attacks, economic pressure, deployment of irregular armed groups, and use of regular forces. It's the combination of these tools with one another, being supercharged by technology and technical innovation, that has made these new threats that the Alliance is really trying to grapple with.
So I think for the internationally minded community and all us foreign policy wonks and dorks, we started paying attention to this in around 2014, around the invasion of Ukraine, and then the rest of the population plugged in 2016. How has disinformation evolved since then?
I think we've seen a good bit of evolution in terms of tactics. The strategy often involves a range of different elements. Some of it is to simply confuse what the idea of truth is. That may involve injecting sort of false narratives into particular conversations, but sometimes it's using technology itself by being able to train algorithms or game them in order to promote particularly whether it's provocative kinds of narratives, extremist narratives, and we have seen the ability to do this getting better over time. We see different parts of the social, whether it's the social media ecosystem or the broader information ecosystem, playing a different role in how these narratives evolve. And we see, you know, we heard in the earlier panel actually the conversation about deep fakes, and there it was in the context of, I think, particularly pornography is what was highlighted there. We've also seen, many of you may have seen this faked video of President Obama saying things, appearing to say things that he has never said. And so I think that we can anticipate that while the threat itself is already evolving in the way that it's manifesting, it will continue to evolve in the future, both as technology changes and as the authoritarians who are typically the ones who are using these tools learn lessons and are able to employ those as well.
And we've also talked about this separately, about how this has spread past Russia, past the US, past the EU. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, I think we see that Russia has been sort of the biggest purveyor of some of these tactics. But in many of these countries, whether it's within the EU, NATO, the United States, we see actors within our countries who are beginning to understand the power of information operations, disinformation, of these asymmetric tools to be able to be used with and against one another. Some of you, especially from Washington, may have followed the proxy wars that have been being fought between the UAE and Qatar. And actually what they've been doing is hacking each other's emails, sometimes inserting false documents into those hacked materials, handing them off to reporters and others, and then weaponizing that information so as to attack each other and influence political debates in Washington about the Gulf states. So it's just another one of the manifestations of this kind of tactic. Just today there was a news report as well. This is a little more on the election interference side of things, but how China appears to have actually been hacking some opposition party leaders in Cambodia and ahead of elections there. So this is a set of tools that actors, both at the state level and the non-state level, can and will continue to adopt.
And do you think the US, NATO, the EU, are these organizations doing enough? And what have they done?
So the first answer to have they done enough is no.
Why did I anticipate that?
But I can come back a little bit to that. What have they done, though, I think is important to highlight, because as you noted, it really was, Ukraine in 2014, where a lot of these tactics, which had been around, but were really tested, perfected, and then, taken beyond those borders. And since 2014, we have seen a lot of action happening both at NATO and at the EU. In 2014, at the Wales summit, NATO actually declared that that cyber attacks could lead to invoking Article 5 under the Washington Treaty. In the 2016 Warsaw Summit, NATO adopted a strategy for countering hybrid threats that included coordination with the EU, which is really important. NATO has been a thought leader on these issues, has set up some centers of excellence looking at different parts of the hybrid toolkit, including one focused on disinformation that's done some really good work. And there's discussions of how to use the Joint Intel and Security Division here at SHAPE in order to be able to improve NATO understanding and analysis of hybrid threats. Similarly, at the EU, we've seen a high-level group that was formed that released a communication setting out sort of an EU approach on these issues. Both NATO and EU have StratCom teams that have been doing a lot of work on these issues. So we have seen a recognition that NATO, EU, and frankly member states need to be doing more to address these threats.
Is there anything more they should be doing? What else can they do?
So that answer is yes. There is definitely more they can be doing.
Do it.
One of the things that strikes me about this challenge, having worked in government previously and now working on this from the sort of think tank civil society perspective, is there are structural challenges to addressing these kinds of issues. Our governments aren't particularly organized to see the full spectrum of these threats. For intelligence communities, disinformation, it operates in the open in many ways. It's the kind of thing that hides in plain sight sometimes. And so we need to be sure that we're better having the tools in place and the right priorities to be able to analyze what is happening on our platforms within our countries and beyond. Also on the structural front, again, the centers of excellence, for instance, that have been established are great, but they're not at the center of decision making. They're not at the center of planning. I think we really need to see further integration of dealing with these challenges, really, at the center of planning and decision making. And the other piece is Article 3 of the Washington Treaty gets overlooked sometimes, but it's about resiliency. It's about the need for member states, for the allies, to all focus on building resiliency within their own countries in order to be able to defend themselves. And this is where things like, election security, cyber security, being able to make sure our financial systems aren't being exploited and used for corrupt purposes, all of this is related to these hybrid tactics, which disinformation is one part of. That resiliency piece is something I think that's really important to take to heart when we talk about these threats, because so much of defending ourselves really starts with strengthening ourselves at home.
So jumping off of that, the piece about strengthening ourselves, what about kind of softer measures like trying to improve our population's media literacy to be able to recognize something that is fake, or to be able to trust when somebody tells them it's fake? Is there anything that governments can do on that front?
Absolutely. This is a whole of society problem. So there's things that governments can do, individual national governments and multilateral institutions, but civil society absolutely has to play a role here. Mm-hmm. Resiliency, raising awareness within populations, inoculating against these threats, it's absolutely essential to dealing with them. We're never going to stop disinformation, right? I mean, again, it's been around for thousands of years. This is not a particularly new phenomena. It's the scale and scope of it, and that really is going to require us to make sure that our populations, have the tools to think critically about information, to evaluate the information they're seeing. That's one of the challenges that's presented by the internet, because it does actually, in some ways, remove some of the context cues that we're used to seeing. Let me give one example. So in the wake of the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury earlier this year, can't quite remember why. I was going to look for I think the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and I was on Google, and I typed in NATO-Russia. My mic just died. I think my mic just died. Mm-hmm. It's gone. Okay,
Perfect.
I'll project really loud. Can you guys hear me? Maybe we can get a hand mic. So I go onto Google News and I type NATO-Russia founding, or NATO-Russia, and the top article that pops up, thank you so much. Now I can not shout at all of you. The top article that popped up was from Sputnik. And the headline was, NATO behind Skripal poisoning in order to justify increased defense spending. Now, that was what Google News was telling me was a top item on NATO and Russia at that point in time. So the context cue being sent by what we trust there, Google, search engine, is that this is something we should trust. Now, I'm guessing most people in this room know that Sputnik might be something to be skeptical of. But a lot of readers in different places may not know that. And that's why these context cues, that's why these critical thinking skills are really important.
I mean, there are a lot of American voters that I know covering the 2016 campaign who quoted RT back to me. And when I said, you know that this is fully funded by the Kremlin, they said, well, how is that different than NPR or BBC? And so my question is, how do we as societies that believe in freedom of the press, believe in a certain freedom of information, protect that freedom while dealing with actors like RT, like Sputnik, without kind of inhibiting that freedom? How do you find that balance?
It's a critical balance. And I think, for me personally, I think about this from the perspective of what we're trying to protect are our democracies. Mm-hmm. And so we have to start from that premise, that any of the steps we take to fight these tactics must be in furtherance of democracy and not to the detriment of it, right? I sometimes get the question, well, why don't we just do the same things that the Kremlin does? Why don't we just promote our own disinformation? Well, being a part of the race to the bottom of truth is not something that I believe is constructive for democracy. But it does mean that we have to face some really critical choices. This is an area, frankly, where there's some differences between a lot of the approaches we see in Europe and what we see in the United States. The U.S. has a very, very strong view on free speech rooted in our First Amendment. I think within Europe, and particularly in countries like Germany, there is a lot more of a tradition and a focus on being able to remove content that is found to be offensive or untruthful. Those are different national contexts that will inform the steps that are taken. For me, I think there's a lot that we can do by focusing on the sources of these disinformation operations, right? So one of the things that we see a significant amount of now is the use of these fake and false personas to spread information or falsely amplify what may be true information. That's where the platforms really come in here, right? That's where we need the social media platforms to really be able to step up, enforcing their terms of service so that you don't have people masquerading as Americans sitting in, a basement, halfway around the world, trying to trick Americans into thinking that something may be the case when it's not.
So do you think that these platforms, these big players in the tech industry need to do more on their own? Because, these Senate hearings where these aging senators are struggling to demonstrate that they understand what Facebook even is, how effective is that? And should governments regulate these companies? Should they regulate themselves? What do you think the tech industry needs to do here?
So I think it's going to be a blend. I mean, I think first of all, we need greater tech literacy in the national security and policy community. This is an area where we have big gaps. The national security community, foreign policy community doesn't really understand tech in the way we need to. And on the flip side, the tech community really doesn't understand what are the national security threats that we face. How might technology that seems like it provides some wonderful goods on its face actually be perverted and used against us, right? So we need greater literacy and connectivity in both directions to bridge that gap, number one. Number two, I do think there's more that the companies can do on their own. For instance, just on Friday, Twitter announced that they're now taking down about 1 million fake accounts every single day. That's stunning. Now, as a result of announcing that they're doing that, Twitter took a pretty big hit over the weekend on their market share. And that may bounce back, but to the extent that they're cutting into their own bottom line, I think it's really important to recognize the fact that they're doing the right thing, at least in the short term, right? They're doing the right thing. Facebook has certainly also been taking steps. Others have been, taking steps to address these threats. And I think there is more from the sort of responsible stakeholder role, if we want to apply that to the tech companies here, that they need to do. But there is going to be a place for regulation in certain areas. I think my own view is we have to be a little careful about that. Technology changes so fast. If we're regulating, you asked earlier, how is this threat evolving? If we're regulating for the last battle, we may end up losing the next war. And if we put in place arcane rules, that are basically obsolete by the time they go into force, that's not really going to help us either.
But that's also a perennial problem, right, where the technology outpaces the law. And, for example, there's still, in the U.S. at least, not a good way to police online threats, right?
Yeah. That is where, though, I think there are some broad areas where we can put down some principles, right? So whether that's on, for instance, Europe has been really leading when it comes to thinking about data protection. Now, GDPR may not be the right model for the United States, but it does put in place a framework around how do we think about data protection, data security. How do we think about privacy? These are conversations that we really haven't even had in the U.S. that are underlying a lot of these challenges, especially when it comes to the technology. I think that thinking in those broad principles, that's important. There's also some narrow areas, things like, political advertising when it's online. Should it be subject to the same kinds of, requirements that we see for political advertisement on any other media? I mean, to me, that's a pretty, basic answer of yes. It's a narrowly tailored kind of thing where I also think that we can think about some kind of smart regulation. But, it is an area where the EU has really been leading and pushing the envelope and actually pushing the tech companies to do more. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that.
And do you think on the U.S. side it's a result of, this First Amendment absolutism, or is it just a reluctance to regulate?
I think it's a little bit of a reluctance to regulate. I think, some of it is obviously pressure from interests in Silicon Valley. But I also think, it goes back to what you were pointing out earlier about, how the hearings that we've even had on these issues in Congress show that our members of Congress don't even really understand what it is we're talking about. And until we have a really literate body of policymakers who can really dig into these issues and take them on in the same way we've seen, our policymakers be able, we have some members of Congress who are super conversant on very, very wonky, detailed defense issues. That's a really good thing. We need that in these areas. We need people who can actually be the leaders in the same way we have had on other issues.
And I think for my last question, I'm going to ask you something a little spicier, which is, what do we do with disinformation at home in our home countries? In the U.S. we have Fox News, we have the president's Twitter account. Russia's not doing that. I don't know how you can regulate for that. Maybe that's more about political polarization at home. We were talking about AfD in Germany as well. What do you do when these efforts naturally fall on and amplify these rifts and paranoias in the places that are being targeted?
It's one of the hardest parts of this challenge because in some instances, what outside forces need to do in order to influence our debates internally, really, once they've been able to recruit and establish proxies or even others who believe the information that they've been receiving, become really convinced of it, it's very, very hard to deal with in the same way. Again, I do believe, if there are Americans who are sympathetic to the Kremlin, and believe that that's the right way of looking at the world, that's their right as Americans to believe that. I may try and convince them otherwise, but that's the right as Americans. But I think it's that ability to have real and meaningful debates, to be able to overcome that polarization, to not get grounded in our echo chambers, and to be able to have a basis for conversation and fact. And those are the principles that I think we have to get back to, and that's what's ultimately going to make us resilient to this, because the bottom line is, these points that you're making in terms of our own internal forces, these are things that Russia and others who actually want to undermine us, that they're able to exploit, and we simply can't allow that to happen.
All right. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for our next host, Sebastian Springer of Defense News. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Laura.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a seat, please.